What we're going to do in this final panel is have the four of us talk about something that went on beyond the armistice. It had its origins in the war and had in many ways, a much longer legacy than just the immediate aftermath of the war. And what we'll do is, in the order that we have here, each of us will talk for 5 or 10 minutes and raise some of these issues, and then throw the rest of the time we have until 4:30, and we're back on time, by the way, I might point out, or close to it, to either discussing these things or similar things that you want to raise, but basically have an opportunity not only for you to ask questions, but to state views or bring up topics of your own that we haven't discussed. And what I'd like to start with is to talk about a country, one of the great powers that we haven't talked much about, and which was very important at the beginning of the war and turns out to be really important by the end of the war. And that's Russia. And I won't go through the history of Russia during this war, but basically Russia was in a state of military and economic collapse by March of 1917, the month before we entered the war. It was fairly apparent to everybody that it was not doing well at all, with mutinies, with starvation, with all sorts of problems on an enormous scale. It essentially lost the battlefield war, and there was a lot of unrest, and it was not clear what the future of Russia would be. But the hope was, and I think Wilson was particularly enamored with the idea of being somewhat of an idealist, that what would follow the Tsar, I mean, there's this autocracy that's just shortly out of serfdom and very weak economically, that it would be replaced by a more moderate government that would stay in the war. It's very important to the French and the British that the Eastern Front be maintained and the Germans not be able to move so many troops to the Western Front. And so there was a first revolution, a fairly moderate government came into play, but that didn't work well enough. The Germans weren't terribly cooperative. The Germans wanted to cause more trouble, and among other things, what they did is throw Lenin into a train and sealed it up and shipped it off to Russia. And there was a great deal of internal conflict, and sort of the Bolsheviks came out on top. And this is very important because what the Bolsheviks were advocating was a truly revolutionary, if you like, full Monty, ideologically based form of government and economy that was very much different from that of the monarchies or the capitalism-based democracies that were parts of the other great powers. And essentially, they were advocating class warfare, where the workers and the peasants would essentially overthrow and violently and really go ahead and exterminate the wealthier classes. I mean, this was really class war. This is the essence of the kind of communism that was being advocated. And they were very, if you like, evangelically aggressive in trying to export their brand of revolution elsewhere. And given the state of most of Europe, there was a lot of receptivity to what they were offering. To the point, for example, where the German surface navy basically started setting up Soviets. They basically dropped out of the war unilaterally, and they and lots of people all over Europe basically looked to this model, which on paper looked like a form of salvation. This model, which was brutally pursued, did not appeal to, if you like, the class of bankers and capitalists in most of the so-called democracies. And it scared the hell out of them. And what happened at the end of the war, towards the end of the war, is that the Leninist government essentially, now this is a very simplification, basically they threw in the towel. They essentially surrendered to the Germans. And this enabled the Germans, and Ludendorff in particular, to move a whole lot of troops to the Western Front and try for that spring 1918 offensive. Okay, again, this is a bit of an oversimplification. This is a train that we haven't discussed at all in this conference, but it is of enormous importance. And that didn't work out. And at the end of the war, we had, and the British and French in particular, were concerned that we have a new big-time enemy out there. And I won't go into much details, but the British, who dragged us into it as well, basically put some troops. We had one regiment along with a lot more Brits up in northern Russia and Murmansk and Archangel and then out in the Far East. And there was an enormous amount of conflict, civil war, in what was Russia. And this continued well after the armistice and essentially provided the United States with something it had never had before, and that was a universal alternative to our idea of capitalism-based democracy. Okay, again, this was a full Monty ideology, economic, political, military, and this was truly revolutionary. And it was very, very disturbing to a whole lot of people in this country who found it desirable. Necessary is very debatable, certainly at that time. Desirable, in fact, to have a long-term foreign enemy. And we didn't prepare for it militarily. To pick up on some of the points that Phil brought up at the end of his last comments. But this was the first of the big-time Red Scares. And it was very important domestically. It was used to argue against various forms of labor movements in the United States. All sorts of people were jailed. I mean, anybody who expressed any sympathy even for very mild forms of socialism were essentially considered to be traitors by a lot of people. But in any case, we ended the war with the autocratic czarist Russia replaced by something very different. And this was going to stick with us for the next 100 years. It's still here. Some people thought it ended. The extreme form, the class warfare kind of thing, ended with the end of the Soviet Union, again, as an oversimplification. But we, for the 100 years after World War I, were conscious, as we had never been before, of long-term foreign enemies. Okay? And with that, let me pass it on to Monique.
Thank you so much, Cy. Cy brought to your attention the Eastern Front. And I think that is what I would like to talk to you about very briefly right now, because the war did not end on November 11, 1918, as Americans, and in fact many French people, and many British, so despite the small contingent which had been sent to the Eastern Front and to Russia, either close to Archangelsk or sent to Vladivostok. What happened, and which was absolutely terrible, and what Americans know even less than they know about World War I, are those years after World War I, where Eastern Europe and the Middle East was so much exposed to violence that in fact the combat in World War I were just, business as usual, from Gallipoli to the massacre of the Armenians, from the way the Czech Legion behaved when it returned, from the way the Christians in Turkey were pushed to the sea at the time when Greece and the Turks agreed on an exchange of population. You have the most horrendous description of all of those Christians in the harbor of Izmir. The city was burning, women, children, everybody was massacred. Christians were put in churches and burned to death. Another time it will be Muslims who will be pushed in a mosque and burned to death. I'm married to an Austrian. What happened in the former Austro-Hungarian Empire, on the border with Romania, in all of those states which before that had been part of one unified country, or a double monarchy, if you want, starting in the middle of the 19th century. But all of those ethnic groups had learned to live together because they respected one authority above. So the whole notion of self-determination brought by President Wilson, that John says applies only to the white race, I think it doesn't even, the point was that President Wilson did not understand the geography of Europe nor of the Middle East. He did not understand the complication that came from there. Where do I want to lead you there? First is to understand that when the armistice happened on November 11, 1918, you had then a series of treaties. The first treaty we should remember for World War I was the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which was signed in March 1917. I'm bringing it back to your attention because the terms the German put on the Russian were 3 or 4 times more punitive than what the French and the British and the American put on the Germans. So to want to say that Nazism was a result of the financial damages we put on Germany is a total absurdity. I think one of the major issues was that because, so Brest-Litovsk, we have spoken about that. Then you have the Treaty of Bucharest, and that is interesting because this was signed in May 7, 1918. This was a time where Romania, which had been fighting on the Allied side, was really thinking that the Germans were winning the war. We are in May 1918. By that time, the tide had not turned, and there again, Germany imposed drastic conditions on Romania. So now we come to November 11, 1918, and from there to June 28, 1919, and the whole peace treaty negotiation, which were really in fact done by the four big powers. The Japanese at first were considered one of the five big powers, but after the clause about racial equality was refused by the British and by the Americans, mainly by the Australians, who were pushing the strongest against racial equality. The Japanese, bottom line, stayed in the conference, but those were low-level Japanese diplomats. The big delegation went back to Tokyo. So you had only the Brits, the French, the Americans, and the Italians. The Italians eventually were also highly annoyed because they did not get what they wanted from having changed side by the beginning of the war and gone to the Allies when they had their pacts, in fact, with the German and the Austrian-Hungarian. So you all know, June 28, 1919, the Americans, the president signed the Treaty of Versailles. It is not ratified by the Senate. Then, and John will speak about that more, the United States goes back to isolationism, and you completely forget what is happening in Europe. So during that time, the rest of Europe, except for France and Italy, England still, the United Kingdom has some issues with the Irish. But except for those three countries, the rest of war-torn Europe remains in a state of war that lasts for the next 3 to 5 years. During that time, a series of treaties are signed. One point I also want to mention, which we forget completely, is that because we were afraid that the Germans would not accept the term of the Treaty of Versailles, we kept the blockade against Germany between November 1918 to June 1919, continuing to starve the German people and the Austrian-Hungarian people to death. And that, when I say to death, it's absolutely true. The number of people who died and of children who died was absolutely incredible. And that is an irony. And I'm just mentioning that as an aside, as a food for thought, is that for the anniversary of the Treaty of Versailles, as a World War I Centennial Commissioner, I am organizing with a steering committee that is commemorating the Treaty of Versailles and the role of American philanthropy during World War I. We did a phenomenal philanthropy during the war and after the war. Without the Americans, France would not have been able to rebuild itself. But those are the two sides of the coin. During that time, we were continuing to starve Germany to death. So anyhow, hunger is not a good sign to keep people quiet and in a good mood. So that also kept all of those issues coming. So then you had the Treaty of Saint-Germain-en-Laye in September 1918 with Austria. You had the Treaty of Neuilly with Bulgaria in November 1919. You had the Treaty of Trianon with Hungary in 1920, in June 1920. You had the Treaty of Sèvres with the Ottoman Empire, and then you had a revolution that happened in the Ottoman Empire, and all what had been discussed at Sèvres had to be renegotiated in Lausanne in 1923 between Turkey and the Allies. And that was the time I was talking to you about the Greek population being moved back to Greece. Also, those Greeks had been for several centuries living in Turkey. Most of them did not speak a word of Greek. They only spoke Turk, which is one of the reasons why They would then join en masse the Communist Party in Greece and create a lot of upheaval in Greece later on. And they were the doctors, the pharmacists, the traders. They were really the well-to-do Turks that were sent back to Greece as paupers. Then you had the Treaty of Rapallo between Germany and the Soviet Union in 1921, the Treaty of Washington with the United States in 1922, the Treaty of Locarno and finally signed in London between France, Belgium, Great Britain, Italy, with Germany, Czechoslovakia, and Poland to solve the issue of a Poland that had not existed before, or that had existed a century before, but not for a while, and give various parts of various countries to Poland. So that was in 1925. So during that whole segment of time, Europe and the Middle East were absolutely in a state of complete devastation. And I just wanted to bring that to your attention because the war did not end on November 11, 1980.
I see Monique has in part given me some marching orders. But before I do that, General Breedlove's anecdote reminded me of a personal anecdote. My family from the First World War. Having trouble hearing?
I think you may need to use the other microphone, sir.
Check and see, replace the batteries. I mean, just
Oh, okay. Hello? We okay again?
Yeah.
Okay, good.
It wasn't just on.
Oh, okay. Personal anecdote, somewhat similar to the one, but this isn't apocryphal either. My granduncle, my great uncle on my mother's side fought in the First World War in the much maligned 92nd Division, in the even more maligned 368th Regiment that allegedly failed to take its positions. The attack that they were given, they weren't prepared for, they didn't have the equipment for it, and a regiment was supposed to take position in front of them. Their commanding officers said, and the commanding officers, one needs to remember, were not for the success of the division. In point of fact, they were looking at the post-war and planning, if they could, to make certain that the peacetime army had no black officers in it and as few black soldiers as possible. They wanted a white peacetime army. The actual fact of the matter is, and this comes from a testimony from a white captain in one of the battalions, was that 2 of the units did not take the position, his did, and held it. All that occurred on October 30th, 1918. That is exactly the same day that my uncle in the 368th Regiment, my great uncle, was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross and the Croix de Guerre for pulling his white commanding officer who had been wounded in the wire, going out, getting him, and bringing him back to American lines. I never met great Uncle Thomas because he died at 34 from the after effects of the war. But I met his younger brother and his niece, and they had the medals. They had his Colt 45, 1911 automatic. And I asked great Uncle Harry, well, did he ever tell you about what he did? And Uncle Harry said, Junior, he just did, he got his commanding officer out of the no man's land. He said, oh yeah, he did say one more thing. He went to his grave trying to understand why he had saved the son of a bitch. Because he hated his guts, as did most of his other underlings. And the bottom line is that you're trained You do what you're supposed to do in combat.
That's right.
You disregard that. And the problem, unfortunately, with portrayals of African American soldiers in the First World War, and this was summed up in a War College report of 1925, basically claimed that you shouldn't waste any time training colored soldiers for combat because they had small minds, their brain size was small, they didn't have the intelligence, they didn't have the initiative, they didn't have the capacity. All lies. Because if you look at the number of Distinguished Service Crosses, one awarded to black soldiers in the 92nd Division and in the 93rd Provisional Division, there are substantial numbers of them. The fact that the only 2 Medals of Honor awarded to black soldiers were done in 2003 and 2015 is simply because, unlike World War II, where the Army reviewed the Distinguished Service Crosses to learn that 7 black soldiers had been recommended for the medal by the commanding officers but were ignored, they have not done the same thing for the First World War. And it's my contention, my co-author's contention, and they're working on this now in DC, that there are a good number more black soldiers out there who should have gotten that medal and were ignored. So understand one thing. This was a missed opportunity by the United States of America and the armed forces. That our racism, and racism does make you stupid if you ever have any second thoughts about it, that our racism prompted us to ignore and denigrate the achievements of men who were just as valiant and just as capable of combat as any other race, and basically to write them out of the war and say they weren't any good. And the irony of it is that they ignored the most highly decorated regiment in the American Expeditionary Forces in that report, the 369. They left it out completely. So that's what historians are all about. It's to set the record straight and get it right, no matter how many years after it happened. The problem further continues, because having done that, we start the Second World War, and General Breedlove and I were talking about this last night. We started literally the same place. We backed up and then had to come from behind again. And you think, how many times you're going to do this? Well, finally, Korean War, we come to understand the one simple fact of life. You can't have 2 armies. You can't have one black and one white. You've got to integrate. And the unfortunate thing is, one American historian put it very succinctly, was that if, and he was talking about World War II, if we had integrated our armed forces then, and I presume you might all know, that there were 85 5th black platoons in the U.S. Army in 1944-45, infantrymen who were attached to the 4 normal platoons of a company, all of them white companies, because of the shortage of infantry after the Battle of the Bulge in the Hurtgen Forest. And they had to give up their rank because no black officer or man could ever give an order to a white man. They were basically put with these white companies. Their record, as David Colley, historian, Blood for Dignity, points out, was exceptional, was outstanding. And that the white officers observed that the black men often fought better than their own white soldiers because they had more to prove. So you hate to talk about what we call eternal recurrence, if you want to be philosophical about it and talk in Nietzschean terms, but you have to learn the same damn lesson over and over and over again before you get it. That's dumb, and it's a waste of time. The funniest thing about it was I talked about this to the University of North Georgia Military College up there. And my son fought in Special Forces in the Iraq War. And it was funny because a number of those young men were veterans of Iraq, and they came up to me afterwards and they said, sir, we just want to inform you that the Army isn't like that anymore. And I began to laugh. I said, I think I know that. I had uncles and family who fought in World War II, and our son simply continues that line. And at the same time, it is very much of a different service. And my uncle fought in World War II, was an occupation in Germany after World War II, and fought in Korea basically, had observed. He said, you know something? It's going to take the society a long time to change. He said, but the only place where you are treated the way you ought to be, and he was back at Fort Benning the time before he deployed to Korea, he said is on a military base in the U.S. military establishment. He said you go off that base and you get treated like crap if you're a black man in the South. So, as a Southerner, I always think it's worth pointing out that we really didn't learn what we could have learned. Instead, we lurched back into the grips of the KKK. We lurched into isolationism. Isolationism is much safer because you aren't being scrutinized as much by others. And what we had to come to grips with World War II was the fact that not having wanted to fight that war, 800,000 members of the America First Committee, which didn't want to join the war and finally disappeared on December 7th, 1941. They evaporated just as quickly as they had risen. That we hadn't learned the lesson of the First World War, which was that if you have allies, and more crucially, if you have a country that threatens to dominate the European continent, and a country in Asia that threatens to dominate the Asian continent, you can't sit on your behind in the United States and hope the war will not get to you. It will get to you ultimately. Hitler planned to bring it to us, whether we liked it or not. And so, and one of the things that we had better remember, and it's been 70 years since, we better remember that, as General Breedlove was saying, who did NATO come to the help of the United States in Afghanistan? It's a two-way street. We sometimes think that we're the ones doing all the giving. Not quite, not quite. We should have seen that in the First World War. And I think beyond that, that once we had to face the glare of international view in World War II and afterwards, that was one of the things that basically made us decide we needed to clear up our problems of segregation, because I was abroad in Africa in 1959 as a teenager, and the one thing everyone raised, whether France or Africa, it's not that other people don't have their problems, they said, what is wrong with the United States? The Soviets were pointing racism out as our Achilles heel. And they were jamming and ramming that home all over the globe. And finally, that's when we had to face up to it. It wasn't just what was going on in Selma and these other places, that the rest of the globe was saying, you have a serious problem in your own house. And if you can't clear it up, you have no right to claim the leadership of the globe. And you certainly have no ability to claim it in any sort of moral sense. You are just as bad as the rest of us. So it's been an interesting history in that sense. We have made progress. It's come slowly and steadily, and for every step forward, we take 2 steps backward. And we understand that. We hope we'll be able to take another step forward soon, not too late, but soon. And I would just suggest, in terms of Monique and questions of international affairs, that when we left Europe after World War I, we pulled our soldiers back. We didn't pull our loans back. That was one thing we had that we wanted to keep. And when did we do that? In 1930, when the Great Depression struck us. We pulled in all of the loans that we had floated in Germany, and Austria, Hungary, and that pulled the rug out from the German and Austro-Hungarian economies in 1930. The Second World War does not begin at Versailles. The Great Depression is what really pitches the globe, and Germany and Austria-Hungary and Japan. That's what starts the slide to the Second World War. And we compounded that mistake by the smooth tariffs, which made our economy much worse and made the global economy worse. Tariffs don't work. And we learned that the hard way, but we don't seem to remember the lessons that we learned. So I think this is one of the things that you realize when you were dealing with the First World War. Americans don't understand the immense importance, and I think that's something we've been emphasizing all day today, the immense importance of that war as missed opportunities to do things, and then often as a failure to understand why the Second World War really did come about, and it's because we don't understand the period before that. Thank you.
So I'll be very brief. I've already spoken too much. Basically a statement and a question. Mr. Wilson had a lot of some described utopian ideas about how the world should be after the war. He had a lot of utopian ideas about how America's excellence and the excellence of the West could change things in the world, and how democracy could change things in the world. And so of that sprung a lot of things whose legacies I think we enjoy today. And I use the term enjoy as the part of the question in the statement. I'm unabashed. I'm going to share my prejudice with you. I believe that NATO has brought over 7 decades of peace in largely to the European landmass. We've had some skirmishes. One of those I participated in myself to a great degree in the Balkans. But we've had no catastrophic world type cataclysm there because of NATO. And so I believe that alliances can be great instruments of peace, and I think that unabashedly NATO has been that, and that we should take great pride, and we should invest in its future, in the continuance of what NATO means. On the flip side, I think the question is that also out of, and some may argue with me, but out of Wilson's dreams, we have a United Nations, which seems to have gone a bit adrift. And so the question now is, what do we do about it? Do we just let it remain adrift? Do we invest our time and effort with others who might have sway and influence to try to change this organization that had a very pure path in its beginning and now seems to have wandered a bit? And thank you for listening to me today.
Now we hear from
Your questions.
I can see so many questions to ask. I know we're coming to an end. I could think of things regarding racism, isolationism, what is happening with the precious idea of United Nations, and but just different directions to go in. But Monique, you are a representative, you are a commissioner of the national shebang, the national worldwide one, World War I,
US
United States, yeah, whichever way you put it, U.S. Commission. And here we have John, who is a member of the Georgia one. We have our General, Phil, your role in NATO I mean, all these things. Getting back to you, Monique, the idea to me, with these concerns that there are all these injustices in terms of race that are continuing, they were present in World War I and certainly before, should not the Commission, this is the United States one, consider a plan? I don't know when it is planning to end, or maybe it'll pass things on to a World War II one, but should there not be a goal that all of these people around the country could use all these wonderful things that have happened? Couldn't that be done to make an initiative to correct some of these terrible racial injustices? I'm thinking just during the World War I as a start. I don't know.
I think that as far as World War I,
Or later.
as far as World War I think that we are right now, we have created a committee which is working on giving back all those African American soldiers the medals that they deserve.
Okay, so we're on it.
So we,
Okay.
so we
As
are
a start.
on it.
Okay, thanks.
Otherwise, really, my answer to you to solve the ills of this country, and I'm speaking as an educator, one of the results of World War I, which I did not mention to you earlier, is the International Baccalaureate. I was for 6 years the president of the IB. The International Baccalaureate was created at the International School of Geneva, itself the product of the League of Nations. The International School of Geneva was started to serve the children of the delegates to the League of Nations. So the whole idea of bringing a more peaceful world ingrained in an IB program is based on the aftermath of World War I. The point I want to tell you is that as long as we have our teachers of history, and all my respect for the coaches and sport, but who are mostly coaches and have never learned history before teaching it in high school, is one of the major issues we have in this country. I regret tremendously the fact that our School of Education are training teachers on supposedly how to teach, but not in the subject matters that they are supposed to teach. Finally, if our school districts were financed in a more democratic way, which means education in this country depends on local taxes. From the moment where the education is not depending of the state or even of the national level totally for its budget, there will be incredible inequalities. So in all countries of Europe, Japan, Singapore, the budget of education doesn't depend on the small poor village or the small poor district where you live. So I think that, I'm not answering the question about the inequalities, but I think that also speaks to the inequalities, the financing of the school district.
Well, Cy, you were kind to calling me. I really have enjoyed everything everyone has had to say, and thanks for giving me an update also.
Can I add one more thing on education that worries me, and I am often blamed for bringing this up because of my particular background, having spent a third to almost 40% of my life in Europe, 8 assignments. We have lost touch with Europe and America, and part of the reason we have lost touch with Europe and America, in my opinion, is because our military is no longer in Europe the way it used to be. When I grew up as a young captain with the Army in West Germany, looking across the East German border into the Soviet Union, at that time there was more military, U.S. military in Europe alone than there is in the U.S. military now. We had more troops and forces associated in Europe than we have in our entire worldwide military now. And so we had generations of young men and women who well, to be very base, intermarried with and met and knew the cultures of all these nations, both male and female. And we are so disconnected now from Europe that we have people that I had a group of pretty educated people not too long ago, and I gave them a map and I said, label the nations of Europe. It was surprising how badly that they did. Okay, and so we've lost contact with Europe, and I think we have to make a rededicated attempt to understand that we still do half of our GDP across the Atlantic. It's shifting to the Pacific, we all understand that. But today it's still about a half of our GDP across the Atlantic. This is an incredibly important place that we need to regain contact with.
Just quickly along those points. 19% of Americans own a passport. Only 19% of Americans, and this comes off of that point, which means that the great majority of Americans have never been outside the borders of this country. We don't travel. If you spend time in Europe, as the General and I, Monique, has, what you come to understand is they know a lot more about us than we do about them.
It's very true.
And they are not shy about telling you how much more they know than you know about them until you open up, if you're a history student or something like that, and wipe them out with their own history. So it becomes competitive, right? But I think the thing is, what is frightening is that this is a much smaller world, but we have not responded to those connections, and we have pulled within ourselves. When I always tell my students, I don't care what your field is, I teach everyone from engineers, pre-med through humanities, you need to get a passport and travel outside the country, and I do not mean on a Caribbean cruise. That's one thing I would suggest, because we really have got to think about it's just sort of innate isolism. We're a huge country, but I always marvel at the fact that the Germans I met going on the boat over in '69, they were coming back from studying in the United States. They had been all over the United States. And they tell me, well, haven't you been to Arizona? I live in the South. And they would go on like that.
Yeah.
And all these other places, no, I've been in New York though. You know, and finally you'd say, when I get home, I'm going to travel across the United States because I'm damn sick and tired of them bugging me about this. And they've been there and I haven't. But they are very alert to what goes on here. And we are not as alert to what happens there. And I think that sort of carries out what General Breedlove was saying.
Yes, sir.
Oh, I wanted to respond. First of all, thank you for the day and your insights. They've been captivating. I would like to just pick up this last point. I don't really have a question, but it's more of an observation. I'd be grateful maybe if you could comment that what strikes me looking back at the First World War and then the 20th century is this dialectic, maybe just use categories, labels here, nationalism and internationalism. And both nationalism and internationalism have their dark sides. And yet you talk about a smaller global village. Think of the impact of the digital revolution, of those supranational practices like Facebook that we use, that now engagement is going on in a way that is not driven by our national identity, but by something else which stands beyond it. And I commend the calls that you have made towards thinking about how did our sense of tribal need to assert ourselves first drive the alliances into initial conflict in the summer of 1914, and then leave us for the next 100 years struggling with the dark, and we heard so powerfully from Dr. Monique about the tribal massacres that went on in the early 20s around Eastern Europe, while again we tried to find some sense of coming together. Tragically, it comes together under a nationalist, fascist dialectic through the 1930s, And then the general talks about how the coalition of NATO has tried to sustain this international framework of dialogue. In a way, I think Wilson can be rightly criticized, but I've often thought at least he didn't have the dreams that Adolf Hitler was having at the same time that Woodrow Wilson was having. And I recognize Wilson's shortcomings in terms of internal American understanding and the racialism he demonstrated. So my question would be this: how do you see 100 years later that we can get the best of nationalism and internationalism without the demons that seem to come along with it?
So I'm going to take the first swing at it, then I'm going to let some historians really answer the question. Today, we are sometimes unable to have what I would call reasoned conversation about tough subjects because it becomes political immediately. And people begin to label you and put you in this corner, or label you and put you in that corner, and then they tend to attack you based on whatever position it is they're trying to defend. So there'll be somebody in here that'll be angry with what I'm about to say. One of the things that I learned as the SEC here, leading 28 nations, and we had almost that many partners and others working with us, is that yes, every nation thinks about itself first. This is what nations do. Every time we bring something up in the NAC, which is the governing body of the NATO alliance, the North Atlantic Council, you can count on the fact that when the 28 nations speak, they're going to first represent their national position and what's right for their nation. And then you hope to build a coalition of people who are willing to find something that can move the thing forward that benefits more rather than everyone, but makes progress. So nations will always think about themselves first. And you can understand why in America that some people put you in a box if you say that, because we have a political position out there that sort of says that as well. But the bottom line is that's the way nations are going to act. But the fact of the matter is that we can also allow this to bleed over into internationalism versus nationalism. And the internationalism can be labeled as willy-nilly give everybody our money, et cetera, by any nation, to include the United States. They can say that. Why do I internationally? When NATO tried to defend itself against cyber attack, there were about 4 big nations that had been spending a lot of money on themselves trying to fix it. And they're saying, why do I want to spend my money on the other 24 who have not been investing? I'm going to take care of me. And so there are a lot of people who don't understand that. But I use that same example to say, but if NATO has 4 that are getting it right and 24 that are not, that's 24 open doors into us. We need to think more collectively. And so I am not, and this is not a political statement, it's a matter of my 39 years of military history. Isolationism has never helped us. And I don't think it ever will.
Anyone else? Yes, sir.
Oh, well,
No.
When you get
Let's-
stuck,
we-
when you get stuck.
We have been doing all the talking.
Okay.
Okay?
I'll get in later.
Sorry.
I'll be back.
Sir.
well, I'll make my statement and then I'll refer to Professor Hall here. Going back to this question of race in World War I, one thing that frequently is not well remembered about the war is that the French used black troops from the start. They were fighting in French when the Germans first invaded, because they came from French colonies in Africa. And the French used black troops from their African possessions, and I think rather successfully. They had a very creditable record. And this is why they were more open to somebody like Bullard coming over, working on it. And I think that's a point that is often overlooked. And we talk about whatever rainbow coalitions and so on, but the British Empire, of course, used huge numbers of Indian troops in combat as well. And I don't think that they ever got the correct credit they deserved, and these are just some.
The Indian Army was the largest volunteer army on earth
Yep.
during World War I.
Yep.
And World War II, in fact, in terms of the large size.
Well, I just wanted to make those points, because I think that, you know, when it came to African-American troops, again, coming over from the United States, we did have a precedent, which I don't think we learned from, was the French experience, and we could have benefited from that rather than treating them as badly as we did. So, well, okay.
So now it's your turn.
Well,
Are you sure, sir?
No, let's see if anyone else has something. Yes, sir.
I have a question about NATO.
Let them think he did.
After World War I, we learned something. League of Nations came, and after Second World War, United Nations and NATO came. And earlier in this symposium, I think General Breedlove pointed out, only one time NATO's Article 5 has been taken over in our favor in Afghanistan. Now, NATO has kept peace in Europe for 70 years. But what do you think this NATO has done in Afghanistan? Do we have any hope of winning there? Or it will remain a stalemate and then end up like Vietnam?
So let me offer a personal observation. The first time I went to Bagram was about a year and a half after the war started, and I landed at Biak, which is the airport there and pretty close to the center of town, and I just had to move very, very closely over to the palace to talk to the Afghan leadership. And you could make that drive in about 8 to 9 minutes because there was nobody on the roads. There was certainly no children on the roads, and there were no women or female children certainly on the roads because of the way that city was run at that time by the Taliban and others before we went in. So you ask, what have we done and are we winning in Afghanistan? The last 2 times that I've been to Afghanistan probably 30 times, served there a couple of times, but visited about 28 or so. The last 2 times we went over there, it's getting hard to even fly across the capital. So now when you land, you cannot move on the ground across the capital because the streets are full of automobiles and full of vendors and people who are making money. And the sidewalks are crowded, not only with children, but female children. And these children have telephones in their hands, and they're connecting to the world, and they're going to school, public school, in the capital there every day. So yeah, we look and we see that we are not, quote unquote, winning the war. I wonder which war we should talk about, because the hearts and minds of the people have changed. Young females in Afghanistan will never peacefully go back to where they were 30 years ago. They have forever changed. Their opportunity to go to school, to carry telephones, to be in public, to wear dresses, to not cover their faces, these are all things that they treasure. And so yes, we have a long way to go before we militarily win in Afghanistan, but I would tell you that the coalition that's been there for 17 years has had an impact on that society. The question is it sustainable? Have we done the right things so that the changes in society inside Afghanistan are sustainable? I think there's a good argument to be made that we have a lot more to do. And I understand, you and I had a previous conversation, how you feel about that. And I think there's some goodness there. But I just want to say that it's not perfect in Afghanistan. But my first visit to my last visit, I saw a completely different country and a completely different people.
Thank you.
Bill?
General Breedlove, you said earlier, if I understood you, that you were concerned about the inability of our military to make a large-scale sort of maneuver today. And I'd like you to expand on that and tell me where you think, what scenario do you envision where that would be necessary in today's world?
So if today the Russians do what they did during Zapad 13, their last big exercise on the Western, or excuse me, Zapad 17, their last big exercise in the West, And they put 34 battalion task groups, a modest sized force, a modest sized force. They put 34 battalion task groups on the border of the three Baltic nations, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia. And they made a move to connect to Kaliningrad and to seize those three. We are not ready to defend against that, a 34 battalion task force attack. That is minuscule on the battlefield of World War I or World War II. We, as I mentioned, we don't have the transportation to rapidly get there. We have a few ro-ro ships. Our Civil Reserve, Air Fleet, and Navy fleets are fractions of what they were during the height of the Cold War. None of this is a surprise to anyone. Mark Milley is the greatest, Mark Milley, the Chief of Staff of the Army, is the greatest advocate for fixing this. Just listen to our chiefs as they talk to the Congress about what we need to do. It's not because we failed or we're bad people. We have concentrated on what we've been doing for 20 years. We've had soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines at risk in Iraq and Afghanistan in what we call counterinsurgency fight. We shorten it to coin fighting. And so we are the best in the world at supporting our troops on the ground in a coin fight, and we are really, let me say it one more time, really good at that. But what we're not good at is doing what we used to have to do when we thought of the Koreas, or more importantly, the reforger exercises of the 80s as we were always preparing to fight the Warsaw Pact in the Fulda Gap. And so it's not that we've been bad people or we've been stupid or we've been lazy. We have focused on supporting the troops in the fights that we've had now for 20 years. And now Russia has shown us that they will once again use force to change internationally recognized borders. They seized Crimea, and they helped invade the Donbass, and they support the line of contact in the southeast part of Ukraine now. And we are not ready for that fight. We're working on it. We're not lazy. We're working on it. But we just have been focused on something very different for over 2 decades.
David?
Yeah, Dave Stishon, we've got 8 people here from Columbus and Fort Benning, Georgia, from the museum staff at the National Infantry Museum, the National Army and Cavalry Museum, etc. What's happening is that we are 100 years from the United States in World War I, where we had a very similar issue, where we were a constabulary force that was thinking of maneuver and fighting small forces. We are exactly 100 years later, but we are at least looking at large combat operations. General Milley and others are now looking at ways of using history and writing books and chapters to train the new current force of lieutenants, captains, and sergeants on what large combat operations look like. And they're beginning with World War I and fire and maneuver. And yes, General, as we are looking at that, we understand that with the SFABs, and we're sending a brigade of trainers, for example, to the Baltics to help them train. So we are looking at that, and it's something that we have learned from World War I and the 100 years since. Thank you.
My question is about what General Breedlove indicated regarding preparedness for an eventuality which we hope will never come. Regarding the military budget of the United States, there are 2 schools of thought. One that says, well, we have more nuclear submarines and nuclear carriers than the rest of the world combined. So, and in one of those, there is more ammunition than the whole World War II on both sides. And the question remains, what are we doing with $700 billion plus in military spending if we are not prepared? Where is it going? Is it being used wisely? And what is your thought?
It's an outstanding question, and one that the chiefs have been asking themselves for some time. There are some good answers and there are some less good answers. So we have done some wonderful things, which is first and foremost, become a professional military. We no longer rely on the draft, and we now enlist professional soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines, and so we have to pay for them. The personnel cost in our military has risen to be astronomical because we now have to pay these young men and women who are very capable to come do what others won't even consider doing. And then, in order to retain them, we have to train them and offer them things like retirement benefits and other things. And all these things cost money. In fact, the cost of our people is climbing faster than any other cost in our military. I would say the other thing which the Congress is beginning to work on, and actually we corrected it this year for the first time in 10 years, we had a budget. We had a budget on time. Remember that for the 9 of the last 10 years, we began the year by breaking every contract we had with every organization that we had a contract with because we had no money. And so then we have to renegotiate contracts, renegotiate prices. So we have been running contracts for most of the last 20 years in the most inefficient manner. If you were to look at the way we have to pay for things in the military based on the fact that every year we have to negotiate a new budget, and we haven't had budgets for most of the last 20 years when we were supposed to have one. The Scheller Business School would tell you this is an asinine way to run a railroad. Yes. So we have what I would call a horribly inefficient acquisition program based on the fact that we do not have a budget that we can count on from year to year. We know that if you were to go, so for instance, if you were going to buy a car, you go out and pay for, what, let's just say 5 years, and you know what it's going to cost you, and you get a price. But if you went to that same car company and you said, I want to buy a car from you, but every year I'm not going to know whether I'm going to have money next year, and I'm not going to know if I'm going to be able to pay you, and I may have to wait for 9 months at the beginning of the year to pay you 9 months into the year and across the last 3 months. Do you think you would get the same price or the same payment schedule that you get if you tell them I'm going to pay you cleanly for 5 years across 60 months? And so we have some inefficient ways that our budget is used, which is not helpful. Now let me again close with goodness rather than badness. We have, for the size of our military, we have a very lethal and capable force. And that's because we get it right more than we get it wrong. But there is improvement to be made in how we invest in our budget. Some of it, structurally, we can't do anything about until the way that the money is appropriated to us has changed.
From someone we haven't heard from before. Anybody new who wanted to raise something? Yes, sir.
Burdell Jackson.
Oh, Burdell, yes, I'm sorry.
I want to ask, where is the disconnect, General, between our administration, and I mean administration and Congress, to listen to gentlemen like you who know what's going on? Because it seems that we don't have, the Congress doesn't have a vested interest because they don't have any kids in the military. We've got people who think that we're not going to do war anymore. And as a result, nobody signs up. So it's something that somebody else is going to do. So you have just a few people who wind up going in to the military, and the elite of our country don't have any people who are putting a uniform on and getting in harm's way.
I'll try to be quick.
Was that a question?
It was.
Less than 0.5% of Americans today raise their right hand and say, I swear to support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Think about that. What was it at the height of World War II? 28% of Americans took an oath in some manner. So in World War II, 28% of Americans took some sort of an oath. They weren't all exactly just military, but they took an oath to support and defend the Constitution during that war. And today, it's less than 0.5% of Americans take the oath. That scares me to death, because what scares me more than anything else is that our nation loses contact with its military. We enjoy immense pride and support right now, we do. We have to fight every day to keep it because we can manage to screw it up, and we don't want to do that. We've done it before, and we don't want to do that again. But I think your point is well taken. Now, the good news is, in this Congress, it was quite a lot more than the last. And if you watch what's happening in the next elections, there's a whole lot more military. And by the way, they're on both sides of the docket that are running. And so I think that having military people, or people in the Congress with experience in the military, is very good. Let me leave you, I'll get off the stage with one more good thing. Let me tell you that the most nonpartisan bodies in our Congress, in my humble opinion, is the House Armed Services Committee, the Senate Armed Services Committee, the House Appropriations Committee, and the Senate Appropriations Committee. The 4 committees that take care of our nation vote in ways that, if you were to examine it, would make you proud. They do not vote along party lines. They vote, they're conscious to support our military. And so I actually have testified, I don't know, it was a little over 24 times that I've had my butt chewed a couple of times by those people. But what I do know is that their heart is in the right place. Sometimes they have some things to learn about us, but the HAC, the SAC, the HASC, and the SASC, the people that really are about taking care of us, sir, I would offer to you that you can have a pretty fair amount of confidence that those guys get it, and ladies, those guys and ladies get it.
Thank you.
Anyone else we haven't heard from who has an observation, a comment, a question? Yes, sir.
I'm neither a historian nor a politician, just want to make a few comments.
Never really start off by saying what you're not.
You also didn't make it into the army in Pakistan.
Go ahead.
They said you wouldn't take orders, as I remember.
I think, first of all, I have enjoyed the entire program. Thanks for being invited because of my wife. U.S. and Georgia made some other contributions that were not mentioned. As a former employee of a company across the street, Coca-Cola Company, not alone, but among others, introduced a word to business and entrepreneurship in distribution of goods like from Bangladesh, rice, in jute that was used during the war. A lot of that happened because of America. I lived over there, so my recollection of the war from the World War I stories and the second from our generation was that American influence in education, democracy, and entertainment were major contributions, plus in business. So, I mean, those were some of the things that I didn't hear much about.
That's correct. Anyone else want to? Yes, sir.
I want to go back to
Tom McDermott, actually.
Yeah, your comment about.
He's Vat McDermott's grandfather, by the way. Yes,
Yeah.
please, sir.
Our ill preparedness in Europe now to face Russia. What has NATO been doing for? I thought that our NATO forces over there were supposed to be able to handle, particularly since the Cold War ended. You're saying we're not prepared, but how about our European allies over in NATO forces?
So I will be critical now. Again, I'm not going to be political. I'll just be critical. When I was actually driving to the Czech border the day the border came down, and thousands of cars were going west on the Autobahn while my wife and I were driving east past Nuremberg trying to find a radio station to understand what just happened. After the wall came down in Europe, our European allies raced ahead of us in taking peace dividends. And they cut their budgets far farther than we cut our budget. Our military has changed so much. Let me give you an important factoid, and I'll use my service but I was the Vice Chief of Staff of the Air Force at one time. The United States Air Force today is smaller and older than the day it was born. The day that the United States Air Force detached from the Army, it had more people than we have today. And the day that the United States Air Force changed from the Army Air Corps, we had more airplanes and their average age was less than today. For instance, does anybody know when the B-52 was designed?
1949.
Yes, late 40s, very early 50s, the B-52 was designed. When did it come into service?
About 55.
55, 56, it came into service. So it came into service 55, 56. The mother of the last pilot to fly B-52s in the United States Air Force has not been born yet. Let that sink in. The mother of the last pilot to fly B-52s in the United States Air Force has not been born yet. So our Air Force now is smaller. The average age of the equipment is astronomically higher than it's ever been. We have the oldest, smallest Air Force we've ever had in the history of our country. And I would tell you that Mark Milley will tell you some very similar stories about tanks. Mark and I have known each other very well for a long time and served together for a long time. So we all took deep peace dividends, and rightfully so, we've invested a lot in our people because, as I said before, while we may not be ready, I have a lot of faith in our soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, and getting the job done. And sadly, we'll probably do it on their backs for a while till we get it straight in the future.
Larry?
Yeah, just one follow-on to what General Breedlove has been saying. Certainly correct about what we've been doing and training for the past 17 years, but it's also important to note that Secretary Mattis' National Defense Strategy does emphasize conflict against a near-peer competitor, i.e. China or Russia. So we're not there yet, but that's the plan.
That's absolutely right. And that's what I think I said that before. We are on it, and everybody's thinking about it. We're investing in it. We realize that we have a shortage in not only thinking, but investment to be able to fight that fight. Anybody know the last time that a soldier was killed by a fixed-wing airplane? It's Korea, April of '53. So the United States Air Force, the United States Army, the United States Navy have maintained air superiority over our troops since 1953. Not sure it will happen in the next conflict because we don't have ground-based air defenses anymore. We can't protect a forward force on the ground because we've enjoyed air superiority for so long. We have changed our investment schema. And it's the same in all the services. I'm not pointing at the Army. We have changed the way that we defend our nation based on the war that we fought for almost 2 decades, 17 years, 20 years, however you want to parse the onion. But we now have leadership that understands we have to make a change. But you don't turn a battleship in 22 yards. It takes a while, so we've got work to do.
May I suggest that we go back a little bit and think a little bit more explicitly about World War I? We have had a disconnect in the last. Yes.
Okay, so I want to go back to one of the slides in Paul and Laura's presentation, and it was from Emmett Scott's book. And if I read the numbers right, there were like 34,000 white troops from Georgia and 33,000 African American troops from Georgia. Is that
Those
right?
were the ones that were selectmen, or they
were drafted into
yes,
the military.
Right.
Okay. So Lamar has been doing a project through the World War I Centennial Commission because the memorial book that was created for those who perished in combat didn't have any African Americans recorded in it. How many would you say you've uncovered through this process?
African American?
Yeah.
1,230 is the number that we have in our database right now, out of a total of 3,800.
So of the 33,000 that served, about 10% of them perished and we've uncovered about 1/3 of that. So, I mean, this research project and I think it's a really wonderful thing that the Georgia World War I Commission has done to devote that attention to, uncovering these stories. What are the sources we can use, Dr. Morrow, to find the rest of the people?
You gonna unleash me?
Yeah, unleash.
All right. That's what happens when you cut historians out of the mix. You end up being prejudice. Okay? I think one of the things that done, and Sam Friedman, who's also a member of the Georgia Commission, has been very concerned.
Sam still here?
He had to leave.
He had to leave earlier. But he has been concerned that we focused a great deal on Bullard.
Right.
And as a result, we're missing, because you have to remember that we only had 40,000 men who were allowed to fight, but we had 380,000 men who served in services of supply and logistics.
Okay.
And as the French military attaché in Washington said, without those men, we could never have supplied people at the front. We often underestimate the importance of logistics. So that proportion of about 1/3 is actually very fascinating, given the similarity of the numbers, when you realize that most of these guys were not going to be allowed into combat, but will be serving in engineer battalions, what some people call pioneer battalions, which would be behind the front. Then they could take shell fire and be killed, but they had no capability to fight for themselves. And I think it's a very important point. One of the things I have very much appreciated about the commission, the Georgia Commission, as a member, is the fact that the whole commission has really been engaged in trying to set the record right. I'm simply a part of that in terms of how we discuss it, but it's sort of like going, as Lamar has done, and doing all this research, because we're finding one of the more interesting aspects of checking out the 370th Infantry Regiment out of Illinois, is that we learned that one of the Distinguished Service Cross awardees in the 370th is from Georgia.
Right.
And you wouldn't know that if you didn't go backtrack and realize that these northern regiments pulled from all over the country after their initial drafts. So it's a process, a slow process of sort of assembling the data and going through it. And Lamar has.
And those numbers I just quoted were cited were deaths from all causes.
Yep.
Not just combat deaths. As everybody knows, most of them were disease related.
Now, I'm not sure I caught it. The amount was, were you giving for nationwide?
No. State of Georgia.
State of Georgia.
State of Georgia, those who died in service is our
okay.
sort of parameters here.
Yeah, right.
And so 3,800 total, and out of that, 1,230 identified African American.
You know what we'll do? We'll take a look. We got it from a government form that he had put in. Now you saw how I was shifting pages up there. I'll double check to be sure we had the right zeros in the right place. But one of the things I liked about that book was we were trying to find some facts, and he included things that came from the government. He had access to those, and I'm sure others have it too. Okay, we'll do. But thanks for bringing that up. We'll check.
So if there were 30,000 drafted and 30,000 white drafted, would the proportion that were drafted into service of supply be, because you said 380,000 service of supply?
Of the 420,000.
And yeah.
And
I mean, is there any way to know that of the Georgia contingent, or we just assume?
We'll send you what we've got.
What you have to realize is that proportionally, Sean broke it down in terms of specifically the combat element. You notice that the services of supply, 50% more than 50% in combat. Yeah, and what you have to understand is that with African American soldiers, because of the resistance to having them fight in combat, you've got 240,000 in combat and 380,000 in the services of supply, which is a complete and total imbalance from the way the American forces looked in the First World War. And it's because of Southern fears of harming African Americans. And I think, beyond that, just very quickly, the thing always to remember about us in comparison to the rest of the globe, and I was talking with Monique about this earlier, if you go to, first of all, the Victory Parade in July 14th, 1919, there was only one contingent of soldiers in the Entente powers who were not represented in that parade, and they were the African American soldiers of the United States who had been sent home early for fear that there would be problems if they stayed, and the only African American soldiers left were in the services of supply, digging up the graves of those soldiers buried all over France, and then reburying them in the major American cemeteries. And that's the dirtiest job imaginable. As George C. Scott, when he was a Marine, said, that's what made him an alcoholic. Nobody likes to do that. That was our job. The other thing is that if you look at the mural in the Panthéon de Guerre in Paris, once again, black soldiers of America are the only ones omitted from the mural, the war murals. Everyone else, regardless of color, is on that. It's an attempt to erase a part of American history. And that's what the Commission and Lamar and others are doing to try to set that record right.
I might point out, by the way, that after the Civil War, African Americans spent a lot of time digging up graves.
Yep.
And one other group of Americans we have not mentioned at all during today's are the American Indians, because they were also great fighters. They enlisted in twice as many numbers than the average white American. And contrary to the African American, for example, when Pershing was asked to choose a soldier, and his painting is still at the Invalides now, to choose a model for an American soldier, he chose an American Indian. And so that shows a completely different treatment of the American Indians versus the African Americans.
Anyone else? Okay, well, let's hear from you again.
All right, well, and this is a World War I question too, not Cold War. So what kind of headline can we
were talking
expect?
beyond the Cold War for quite a bit.
Yeah. Well, some people are saying we're in another one, but what kind of headline can we expect to see in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution on November 11th? Because I ask that because I think the average man in the street has no clue. But,
Well, none of the people at this table will be here on November 11th. I might point that out, but
they will not
give it a
be
shot.
I was asked to speak at the session of the governor, who will be present, about the armistice on November 11th, 2018. And it just so happened that thanks to Georgia Tech, before they asked me, I'm going to be in France for Armistice Day. Okay. As a historian, I know we're doing things. We have a lecturer, we have a speaker, and certainly the governor will be present. And I think there are great plans. But it just so happens that we're not personally involved. And this is one case where, as a historian, if you ask me where I'd rather be, November 11th, 2018, the centennial, the end of the armistice, I'd rather be in France than here, because that's where it's all happening.
Anyone want to take a shot at a headline? Well, there's undoubtedly going to be a photograph with their grave marker.
What I would like to mention is at the national level, the World War I Centennial Commission is having 3 days of major events in Washington on November 11th, with on the 10th a concert at the National Cathedral about World War I, a ceremony, not a concert in fact, it's much more than a concert, it's a service at the National Cathedral. And then on November 11th, there will be a series of ceremonies happening at Pershing Park, which is the site where we intend to have the World War I memorial that is to be inaugurated, provided we keep getting all the permits, but we got one more today, so it has been jumping hoops in Washington to get all the necessary permits for this memorial that is going to be located 1 block from the White House, at where there is now a statue of Pershing, and 2 walls, one with maps and one with a description of the service of the major campaign in World War I. So it will be a big sculpture representing the soldier's journey, and will be inaugurated on November 11, 2021, on the 100th anniversary of the return of the unknown soldier to Arlington.
Yes, sir.
Just so you know, on the Army side of things, not speaking of what is happening in Atlanta and whatnot, but at least Fort Benning, we are honoring on November 11th at Fort Benning at the National Infantry Museum. This is cooperation with the museum folks and Fort Benning itself. We're going to have passing reviews with Army personnel, as well as all of our European allied liaisons that are at Fort Benning. We're going to have their representation there, and it'll culminate with a battery salute to the guns will go silent right at 11 a.m. On that morning. So we will be honoring commemoration at the National Infantry Museum on the morning of November 11th.
Anyone else? Oh, yes.
Yeah, thank you. On
Virginia.
November 11th, I should say, I have worked very hard to make Georgians across our entire state know about the bells of peace. And Monique referred to that when she gave her talk earlier today. I've been working with church hierarchies, universities. I've contacted every daily newspaper that's printed in the state of Georgia. So please think in terms of nothing else than on November 11th at 11 o'clock in the morning of being part of the Bells of Peace to honor the
Download the app on your telephone.
Right.
Reach out to your churches, the school in the neighborhood, whomever has a bell tower or a bell, so that they ring their bell on November 11th at the 11th hour, please.
Anything else? I will make one other observation, and then we can close, and I'll go back to what I started with here, which actually relates to something. We're talking about forgetting history. How quickly we are forgetting much of the history of conflict of all sorts, the international conflicts across the rest of the century. And I'll say it again, from late 1918 onward, arguably the most singular fact that affected conflict for the rest of the century was the creation of communist countries and communist movements. And there were reasons why they became, and lots of these reasons are rooted in the frustrations of World War I and the carnage of World War I. And as an appeal to all sorts of people, one should not underestimate what the alternative of communism, at least ideally in many people's minds, offered. But for the rest of the century, at least until 1991, the existence of communist countries had more to do with conflict for the rest of the century, including the creation of NATO. I mean, why would we have a NATO? If for what reason? And it took a long time to do that, and all sorts of things were happening in the 20s and the 30s, 1919 onward, and what have you, that involved not just the Soviet Union, but lots of other communist countries and communist movements, and that, I would claim, is the most singular outcome of World War I, from the chaos of World War I, and all sorts of people were so disillusioned with all sorts of things that they were looking for alternatives, and unfortunately, a lot of these alternatives showed up in the form of countries like the Soviet Union. And in some ways, it turns out to be fortunate, because the history of what happened in Germany and in the Soviet Union in the 20s and 30s and what have you, leading up to World War II, gave us this great enemy that turned out to be our most important ally in the war in Europe in World War II. And all the conflicts since then have been based on the existence of this alternative universal ideology, which I suspect nobody in this room misses, but it dominates in many ways the rest of the century. And with my final 2 bits, I only used about 5 minutes at the beginning of this session to bring that up, but I find it disturbing. I mean, they have disappeared as enemies in movies, and when the Nazis are still good for, you know, being an enemy for all, but we are, you know, we're talking about World War I being the forgotten war and what have you. I think we're forgetting all of this too. We're talking in the abstract about all sorts of things, and there is this vague, ghostly, implicit enemy that never got mentioned in any of the kinds of discussions that we've had. With that, and in fact bringing up a conflict that very explicitly involved communists, next year we're going to do Vietnam. It's going to be our symposium. It'll be a Ray Davis Legacy Symposium. Ray Davis was arguably, no insult intended, Phil, our most distinguished Georgia Tech graduate. I mean, this guy, take a look at a picture of Ray with his Medal of Honor, 13 battle stars and what have you. He's arguably Georgia's greatest warfighter. He was Army ROTC, even though he ended up as a Marine. But in any case, in his name, we are going to commemorate 50 years since, among other things, he commanded. He was a 3-star in Vietnam. But all sorts of questions arise. I mean, this is going to be different than this one, because this is a living memory conflict, with no lack of controversy, and all sorts of questions, some along the lines of what we've asked here or talked about here, including racial issues, were still with us in Vietnam in somewhat different contexts, but also very much worthy of some reconsideration. And having said that, let me, because we are back right on time, by the way. For my 2 cents worth, I think we had a really outstanding set of presentations over the course of this day. I learned a lot, actually, and I hope the rest of you did as well. And our coverage, I think, was such that I hope most of you really were exposed to various facts and thinking and issues and what have you that you hadn't considered before, which has been my experience in dealing with people who really are thinking about World War I for the first time ever, perhaps, or in a long time, or since they took some sort of trivial high school course that said something about World War I. So I hope we've achieved something in that regard. And let me in particular thank the rather significant number of you who have stayed to the very end. And also our speakers. We still have food in the back, and let me encourage you all to partake of that. Take it home, feed your dog, feed your kids.